Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out MSI's GE76 Raider. So this is the latest edition for 2021, and it's packing an NVIDIA RTX 3080 16GB GPU, plus Intel's i9-11980HK CPU. Alongside that we find 64GB of DDR4 memory, as well as a 2TB PCIe 4.0 SSD, and there's also a 17.3-inch 360Hz 1080p display. Now, all that hardware doesn't come cheap, as currently this model of the GE76 Raider is listed at £4,200 here in the UK. So should you splash that kind of cash on this laptop? That is what we're going to find out today. Kicking off with the design of the laptop then, as you might have expected given the level of hardware in this machine, it is fairly chunky by modern standards. So the chassis actually measures 3.3cm thick when measured from the desk, and it also weighs in at 2.9 kilos. It's not an absolute monster like we have seen in the past, but it's not exactly a thin and light Ultrabook either. It is well built though, with hardly any flex to the body and only a little bit in the screen, but I'd have absolutely no worries travelling around with this in a backpack. The overall styling is also fairly relaxed as gaming laptops go. The main piece of that gamery flair does come from a large RGB LED strip at the front of the laptop, but honestly I think the rest of it looks quite smart in my opinion. Once you open up the lid of the laptop as well, we get a look at the full-size keyboard. So yes, it does have a numpad. This is another effort in collaboration with SteelSeries with per-key RGB illumination. It's not a mechanical keyboard though, which I must confess I do find somewhat disappointing considering the price of this laptop. The actual key actuation is perfectly fine, but it's just what you'd expect from a scissor switch keyboard, and really I would have liked to see some low profile mechanical switches used here instead. Similarly for the trackpad, while it is absolutely fine to use for everyday tasks, I personally do find it a bit on the small side, especially considering just how much space there is around it. The integrated buttons also feel quite spongy to click, so I do think these could have been improved with a tighter actuation. Like I said, absolutely fine if you're just going to be sending a few emails, but for any half serious work I would recommend using a mouse instead. Thankfully, there are plenty of ports to connect any extra peripherals to. Starting over on the left hand side, we find a headphone jack, one USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type A, and another 3.2 Gen 2 Type C. On the back there's the power input, a Thunderbolt4, HDMI 2.1, mini DisplayPort, and then Ethernet. While over on the right hand side, that is home to two USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports, as well as a full-size SD card reader. Of course, we also need to touch on the display. So like we said, it's a 17.3-inch 1080p IPS level panel, but crucially it's got a whopping 360Hz refresh rate. Before talking about that though, it is worth saying this is a quality panel in terms of its colour accuracy, brightness and contrast. Overall gamut coverage, for instance, saw 100% sRGB and 81% Adobe RGB coverage, while for brightness we're looking at a peak of 336 nits, which is certainly decent, with a contrast of 1280:1. So again, for an IPS level display, this is impressive. Likewise for colour accuracy, we're actually looking at an average delta E of just 1.13, so you are definitely getting a colour accurate display here. My main concern though comes back to that 360Hz refresh rate. While yes, I do like high refresh rate panels myself, I just think if you really need a 360Hz display over something like a 240Hz or 165Hz panel, then surely you have to be an ultra competitive gamer, in which case, would you really be wanting to play on a laptop to begin with? Personally, considering the screen size and the hardware inside this laptop, I think the GE76 would be perfect with a high refresh rate 1440p panel. In fairness to MSI, this does appear to be an option as it's listed on the spec sheet on the MSI Global website, but on the MSI UK page, it appears the only option for the GE76 Raider here in the UK is going to be that 1080p panel with the 360Hz refresh rate. Moving on though, we do also want to touch on the webcam, and thankfully MSI has put this in the top bezel, so that is definitely a good start. I wouldn't say it's of jaw-dropping quality, but it definitely looks good if you can give it enough light, so definitely will do the job for any of your Zoom calls. Of course, we also popped off the underside panel as well to take a look at the internals. Here we can note a few things, including two M.2 slots, only one of which is populated by a 2TB Samsung PM9A1 PCIe 4 SSD. That does mean you have a spare slot, but do be aware that one is only PCIe 3, but it is still an easy way to add more storage. There's also two SODIMM slots, both occupied by 32GB Samsung DDR4 3200 modules, so that's a total of 64GB of memory. We can also note a huge battery rated at 99.9 watt hours, while there's also a killer AX1675 Wi-Fi 6E module. Yeah, I am king. Now it is time to move on to talk about performance. As a reminder, the GE76 Raider is packing NVIDIA's RTX 3080 16GB laptop with up to 165W power draw, and there's also the 45W Intel i9-11980HK with 64GB DDR4 3200MHz memory. While I've not tested a ton of laptops this year, my main comparison is going to be with the Asus ROG G15 Advantage, which Leo recently reviewed, and that is sporting the Ryzen 5900HX as well as the Radeon RX 6800M. Just to be clear as well, there are a few different profiles you can choose within the MSI Center, but all of my testing was done using the Extreme Performance profile. Kicking off with the CPU benchmarks then, it's not really a surprise that the 5900X is a fair bit faster than the 11980HK, with significantly reduced render times in Blender, while it's also clearly faster in Cinebench R23 multi-core, although the single core results are essentially identical. Handbrake encoding also shows an 11% win for the Ryzen CPU, though the GE76 Raider is just about quicker in terms of the 3D Mark times by CPU score. One interesting area to note though is the vastly superior memory bandwidth on offer from the Raider. We know that the Asus G15 DDR4 suffers from suboptimal secondary timings, and that is clearly on show here. That may well be playing a part in the gaming benchmarks too, where the GE76 Raider really comes into its own with that RTX 3080. The Raider proved faster than the G15 in every game we tested, delivering very solid performance across the board. That includes averaging 85 FPS in Cyberpunk, with even better results in the likes of Gears 5 and Hitman 3. Red Dead Redemption 2 is also one of the stiffest tests we have, but an average of 75 FPS from the Raider is still very, very solid. Diving a bit deeper into the behaviour from the CPU and GPU, we really had no issues with the GPU at all. That would happily sit around 1680MHz all day long. The CPU, meanwhile, settled at 3.3 GHz all-core when gaming, but for an intense CPU-only workload like Cinebench, an all-core frequency of 3 to 3.1 GHz was observed. Unfortunately though, the GE76 Raider has clear thermal issues while maintaining those clock speeds, and we actually saw frequent spikes up to 96 degrees while using the stock Extreme Performance profile. That's not quite at TJ Max for this CPU, but it is very close and far too close for comfort in my opinion. To combat that, MSI has actually included a cooler boost option, and this simply raises the fan speeds to jet engine levels, though it does also knock off between 8 to 10 degrees from the CPU and GPU. The cooler boost setting does need to be enabled manually though, so it doesn't happen automatically, and it does come with the clear downside that it makes the system incredibly loud, adding an extra 5 decibels of noise. Rather than me just telling you, why don't I just go ahead and show you with a quick sound test. Lastly, as for the battery life now, while MSI has included a huge 99.9 watt hour cell, it's probably not a surprise that the battery life isn't great overall, considering the sheer caliber of hardware in this machine. So in our PC Mark benchmark, we observed just under 2 hours, and while you can double that to just under 4 hours in the real world, it will be enough to send a few emails and type up a few documents, but for anything half demanding, you will want to be plugged into the mains. All in all then, I think it is clear to see MSI has made a fast gaming laptop with the GE76 Raider, but it is definitely not without its issues, and that is also compounded by the very high £4,200 price tag. Its biggest plus point is definitely that it can play games and play them really well, harnessing the power of that 165 watt RTX 3080 16GB GPU. It's also clearly faster than the Asus G15 Advantage when it comes to gaming workloads. As we have shown though, CPU thermals do really suffer unless you're prepared to live with ridiculously loud fans, which for a system that costs this much, I really don't think is a choice you want to be making. I am also just a little bit confused as to exactly who this laptop is aimed at, with a few questionable component choices. Gamers really don't need 64GB of DDR4 memory, for instance. That would say to me there's at least a suggestion that this machine should be used for some work. But if that was the case, why wouldn't you go for something with the Ryzen 5900HX, which, as we've shown, is faster than the Intel i9 chip in the GE76 Raider? On the flip side to that, we come back to the 360Hz display. I really think if you really need a 360Hz display over a 240Hz panel, you have to be an ultra serious, ultra competitive gamer who I really don't think would be gaming on a laptop to begin with. For me, it gets to a point where you factor in all the small little issues and the niggles we mentioned before. I'm looking at this machine and thinking, yes, it is very fast and it is very good for gaming, but I'm just not sure it justifies the £4,200 price tag. Maybe you are someone who's looking at this machine and thinking, yes, that is exactly the spec I'm looking for, but for me, a system that costs this much has to be pretty much perfect, and I just don't think we're getting that with the GE76 Raider. That is going to do it for this review though, guys, so if you liked it, toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. You can also subscribe and ding that notification bell if you haven't already. And why not come over to our Discord server where you can currently win an RX 6700 XT just by leaving a comment. You can also check out our merch, which is linked below, and why not consider backing us on Patreon, where you can see some of our content early and get access to exclusive giveaways. Until then though, guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.